Welcome, everybody. Email us your thoughts, freedom@charliekirk.com, and subscribe to the Charlie Kirk Show podcast. Take out your podcast app and type in Charlie Kirk Show and subscribe in the upper right-hand corner. Everyone heard the news yesterday. Queen Elizabeth passed away. She was a stoic, wise, and phenomenal leader in public life for 70 years. Never had a misstep, never had a scandal. She loved her country, and she entered one world, and when she passed away, it was a completely different world. Her passing, of course, has basically had every single apparatchik on social media, not every single one, but a lot of the apparatchiks on social media say that she was representing a genocidal, colonialist empire, all this nonsense, which I think actually opens an opportunity for us to defend British colonialism. This is a contrarian take. This is something that you will not hear on a college campus, but I think it's time to lean in and defend our friends across the pond. And no better person to help us do this than someone who has published extensively on this topic, actually has published a piece, The Case for Colonialism, a response to my critics, by Professor Bruce Gilley, and he joins us right now. Professor, welcome to the Charlie Kirk Show.
Hi, Charlie. It's great to be here.
So, Professor, walk us through your argument, The Case for Colonialism. That is a thought crime to say in decent and public society today. As we remember the Queen of England and her passing, it seems appropriate to talk about the British Empire. Why is colonialism something that we should defend?
Well, for two reasons. One is because all the empirical data shows very clearly that if you were colonized, in particular if you were colonized by the British, and the longer they colonized you, and the more intensely they colonized you, the more you are likely to be democratic, developed, stable, law-abiding, and free society today. The empirical evidence is a slam dunk, and there's no doubt about it. And there's lots of things I put out there showing this. Nobody really debates that, but of course the critics are all from the Faculty of Film Studies and flower design, so they don't actually have the capability to understand facts and data. But if you're on the social science side like I am, you know, it's this dirty secret. We all know this, but nobody's allowed to admit it because, as you say, that's a thought crime on campus. The second reason is not just was it good, but the people knew it was good, and it was legitimate. And the reason colonialism, especially British colonialism, survived and thrived as long as it did is because it was essentially carried out by the colonized, not by the British. There were a few white guys hanging around, but most of the colonial police, officials, legislators, judges were the people in the colonies themselves, and they knew from their own pasts that life had got immeasurably better once the British arrived. And the tragedy, of course, is it got immeasurably worse as soon as the British left.
So there is almost an incantation that exists on these campuses. Berkeley, I know that you're up at Portland State. Wherever I speak, they will always revert back to colonialist rule and the massacring of indigenous people. That is not the case of the British Empire. They might be conflating it with other empires, maybe, you know, conquests or attempts of the Portuguese or the Spanish. But the British were very benign. In fact, they did everything they possibly could to institute the rule of law, habeas corpus, respect for the individual. Tell our audience about the legacy that the British Empire left and really helped develop the modern world as we know it.
Yeah, so I mean, on the question of violence, of course, what they do is they say, well, any form of colonialism is itself evil. Therefore, every time a British policeman in Kenya arrests a thief, that's genocidal because that's violence, right? So they don't make a distinction between justified and legitimate use of force, like with a police, or counter-terrorist operations, which the British had a lot of. They had a lot of that because there were a lot of elite traditionalists who liked to engage in slave raiding and plundering and enslavement of other tribes, and they didn't like the fact that the British imposed this civic institutions on these places because it basically deprived them of their traditional prerogatives. So what the British did in these places was not only create the civic institutions, the rule of law, the property rights, the equal access to the political system, the expansion of rights, especially for minorities and women, right? They were the big beneficiaries here. But, you know, at a more fundamental level, the British created these nations. So when people say they colonized us, it's a joke because there was no us until the British came. There were a bunch of internecine slaving feuds going on, or you were actually in the hands of another alien empire that wasn't the white man, but it was much worse. So when people say they colonized us, it's not correct. They colonized a territory and created you as a nation. And places like Kenya and Nigeria are Kenya and Nigeria because the British were there.
So a counter argument people would say is that we can't even have a conversation, and you kind of alluded to this, to the fruits of benign or benevolent colonialism, because colonialism itself is an act of aggression. This is such a sloppy argument because it ignores the fact that every major power prior to the British Empire tried to become an empire themselves. I mean, this was the goal, this was the ambition, this was in the kind of muscle memory of leaders from Alexander the Great to Julius Caesar. It's what you did. You conquered lands and you tried to benefit the motherland. But Britain went about it a different way, where they said, okay, we're going to build an empire, but there is a through line here where we're going to try to respect local traditions, but also bring in a philosophy and a thought process that actually might improve, these parts of the world. Can you talk about how, these people that say, oh, colonialism is awful and terrible, it's the same sort of sloppy argument that they use towards slavery, where they ignore that every single mass power prior to the British Empire participated in much more brutal colonialism than them, but it was the British Empire that actually changed it. Please elaborate on that.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. I mean, slavery and empire are the norm in human history.
Yes.
And every society, especially African societies, were endemic for being slaving and empire building. I mean, all of Southern Africa is basically an empire of the Bantu, who now claim that they're the indigenous peoples. It was the Bantu who kicked the Afrikaners out of South Africa, which is kind of a joke because the Bantu themselves had come in and systematically exterminated the indigenous peoples of South Africa. But they claimed they were being colonized by the Afrikaners. So yes, empire and slavery are the norms in human civilization. Along come the British, and to some extent the French and the Dutch in this kind of early 19th century. And what's happening is these countries themselves are starting to develop these classic liberal norms about individual rights, about property rights, about political participation, about accountability, about freedoms and whatnot. And they can't help but share those ideas with their colonies. Indeed, their argument is, we're not racists. And the evidence that we're not racist is we think everyone can benefit from these same institutions, right? I mean, colonialism in my mind was the greatest anti-racist program in world history because it was the first time any empire said, we think everybody has the potential to benefit from the excellent institutions we've developed. So the kind of dilemma of colonialism was it was essentially a self-liquidating enterprise, is that once you start spreading those ideas and those institutions, it's going to be natural that those people are going to start taking an interest in their own self-government. Well, that was the plan all along. And that's what happened in this country. And it happened in all those colonial countries too. And so when Queen Elizabeth comes to power, I mean, the fruits of British colonialism are ripening as these places develop this desire for self-government. Well, that was the plan all along. And that's the greatest testament to British colonialism.
Professor Gilley, if we could have you for one more segment, I want to talk about the significance and the importance of this argument, because a lot of the radical revolutionary fervor is built on this false premise. Because they say, if colonialism, therefore reparations, property confiscation, therefore we can disentangle ourselves from Western tradition. So it's very important that we have a focused argument here. It's not just some sort of academic debate. It has political implications. It has civilizational implications. Professor Gilley is here as we remember the legacy of the Queen of England, and as many academics right now are trying to misrepresent the British Empire as being something that it's not. It's a very important topic here, everybody, so stay right there, Professor. Welcome back, everybody. Email us your thoughts, freedom@charliekirk.com, and subscribe to the Charlie Kirk Show podcast. With us is an expert on British colonialism, and it's appropriate to speak about this. And it's a very important thing. It's not just an academic debate. It's Professor Gilley. So Professor Gilley, as I was mentioning before the break, in the higher levels of academia that has now, of course, kind of just come down to regular activist circles, a lot of the argument for reparations, for property confiscation is built on this premise of British colonial abuse of indigenous people. This argument is very important on many levels, that one in particular. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I like the idea of reparations. I think that colonial people should pay massive reparations to the British people for all of the public goods the British provided to them and the tax monies the British provided to them. Actually, I don't think that's a good idea. But I think if you're going to talk reparations, the reparations are going in the other way, for sure. There's no doubt about it. I mean, just look at the gap in income and life expectancy levels between places that are British colonies, that were British colonies, and places were not. I mean, do you want to live in the Bahamas or do you want to live in Haiti? I mean, these comparisons are just epic, and the gift of British colonialism was huge. And the genocide thing is funny too, because this is a modern woke, we call these the woke grandchildren of the colonial subjects, right? The colonial peoples at the time never thought of this as anything but legitimate use of force by horrible warlords and terrorists. So for instance, in Kenya, when a small segment of the Kikuyu group rose up and started murdering the white farmers who were the bedrock of the food supply in Kenya, and the British appropriately set up a counterinsurgency campaign that was overwhelmingly and massively staffed by Kenyans, including Kikuyu Kenyans, right? The Kenyans saw this as an amazingly great British contribution. The first president of Kenya praised the British counterinsurgency campaign. I mean, this was seen as a gift of the British to establish stability and the rule of law and to fight against criminals and terrorists. And it's only with the passing of that generation, and then maybe one more, that you get these grandchildren suddenly talking about how they're victims and how their grandparents were victims and demanding reparations for alleged victimization. I mean, it's a complete modern fabrication, and it doesn't represent the views of the colonized peoples at the time.
So in closing here, Professor, I want to ask, why is it that the British Empire acted the way they did, but maybe French or the Spanish or the Portuguese might have been less successful? What made the British approach different?
Well, the Spanish and the Portuguese, of course, is a different era altogether. So we're talking 16th, 17th century. It's a different world, different norms, different expectations. So I don't think we want to compare those. But, 19th century, 20th century British, French, Belgian, Portuguese, Indonesian, German colonialism, we can all compare those fairly similarly. And it's true that the British often did better, but it's partly just because the British had a bigger empire. They had more kind of best practices circulating. They had better training. I don't think any of these European colonial powers did a bad job. I think the British just did a particularly good one.
Very good. Professor, thank you so much for joining us. Professor Gilley from Portland State University. If you send your kid to college and you get taught that, you're very lucky, because that is a contrarian point of view. I can tell you that. Professor, thank you so much.
Thank you.